Okay, so we've kind of spent a little bit of time here just getting a sense of what money is. How would I define it? By its three functions. Um, we've also thought about different types of money or different forms that money could take. And so we took, a little walk through history of some different types of money that we've had, some contemporary ones, things like Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. And we're left with, okay, we have a fiat currency, that's our paper money. And if I was going to count how much money we have in the economy, how would I do that? Right? So that's going to help us understand, why is it difficult to define money would be to say, well, what counts as money? And surely we would say, okay, the currency that's in circulation would count as money. So I can take all of the paper money that's out there in stores and in wallets and all of that stuff. And I can add that all up, and that could be my count of money. And that certainly is going to count. That's our fiat money. Now, what about all the other stuff that I tend to use to make transactions, right? So money is a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a unit of account. Well, what about my checking account, right? So if I use my debit card to buy goods and services, that acts just the same as cash does, right? So my checking account deposit should probably also count as money. And once I go there, I go, okay, well, what about my savings account? I can transfer my savings account to my checking account pretty much instantaneously, and it's then available. And all of this other stuff. So our definition of money is technically what we call M2. And really all I want you to realize about this is that it's our currency that's in circulation. So it's not in bank vaults. It's not being held at the Federal Reserve. It's out in circulation, being used by consumers to buy goods and services, plus all of my bank accounts, basically. Right? So what is included in bank accounts? We have checking accounts, savings, and other similar money market accounts, which are just sort of souped up savings accounts. So all of those things I can pretty much use immediately to buy goods and services, although with savings and money market accounts I have to do a transfer to my checking account before I do that. But what we think of as money basically is something I can use to buy a good or service pretty much immediately. Our definition of that is M2. There's different definitions that we could look at, but we'll stick with this. And, that's somewhere in the vicinity of $15 trillion worth of money in these various accounts. So just the currency in circulation, that's closer to like 4 trillion, somewhere in there. So that gives you some sense of how our money is divided up and how we use that to buy goods and services. Now, what about credit cards? So that's an interesting question, right? Is to say, well, what about a credit card? Does that count as money? And the answer is no. And so there's actually a question on our little learning objective questions, which is coming up here in a second, that has you think about how you use a credit card and how it's not money. And I want you to think very carefully about how a credit card works and think about how that's different than how your debit card is functioning. And so there's an answer to that problem, but credit cards are not in fact money, and we'll hopefully learn why that is in the exercise. So just as kind of a note, right, here's the total amount of money in circulation since roughly 1980 in the U.S. economy, and it's in billions of dollars. So there's a lot of money in circulation, right? So we have these are basically $2 trillion roughly in 1980, and today that's about 17 trillion. And so one thing I just want you to note, it's a little bit hard to see on this graph, but this was a 1 week change here between those dots, which was in the last week of March. The quantity of M2, our money supply, jumped by a fairly significant amount here. So that's, pretty close to almost $1 trillion in jump that we made in 1 week. In 1 week, it jumped that much. So it's an interesting question to ask why, and it has a lot to do with the activities the Fed has been engaged in, the Federal Reserve Bank, in the past month, responding to this coronavirus pandemic. So we'll try to understand, coming up next, what types of things the central bank in our economy, the Federal Reserve Bank, does, and why that would be reflected in a large increase in M2. So what I'd like you to do is there's a few questions that cover both learning objectives 1 and 2 on Canvas. Give those a try, kind of get you familiar with what it is that we've been talking about here. And then we'll dive in next to the next learning objective, where we start thinking about how the money supply and inflation relate to each other.